About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be much fuller if we understood it better. I am Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and culture, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. And Noetic is spelled Noetic. Now, through these programs, we've learned that although the medical world defines consciousness as what we're aware of now, most of what goes on in the mind is not in our conscious awareness at all, but goes on in other aspects. Besides our normal awareness, which we call the conscious mind, there is what keeps our bodies going and includes our fears and beliefs about threats and dangers, the subconscious mind, and what connects us with our highest ideals and guides us in our actions, the superconscious mind. We learned that we can change our state of consciousness, so we're aware of different aspects of mind at different times. Then we learned that the brain modifies whatever sensory signals it receives to fit past patterns of experience, following a default network or structure in the brain. This means that we perceive, we see, hear, taste, and feel what our brains expect to experience based on the past. Now, we've learned that no one has yet been able to pinpoint how ideas and thoughts are formed in brain tissue, and we saw that our body often responds faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel, and often before we're aware of it. Some experiments have even demonstrated that a person's mind continues to perceive and process when the brain and heart are flatlined for as much as several hours, even though the person has been declared dead. Based on all of this, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the cells making up the brain, but is in fact the activity of a field that surrounds and permeates the brain and the body. It's possible to measure at least a portion of this field as electromagnetic activity for several inches around the body in what some say is an egg shape, extending from below our knees to a few inches above our heads. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists whether the body is functioning or not, and permeates and develops with the body and the brain. This means that the brain is best understood as a receiver-transmitter, receiving messages from the mind and transmitting them to the body, and receiving messages from the organs and senses and transmitting them to the body as the subconscious mind. Some researchers are exploring how the two hemispheres of our brain are involved in transmitting and receiving from the world primarily through the left hemisphere and interacting with the mind primarily through the right hemisphere. We've learned that this field of mind affects energy and matter in a variety of ways. For example, when the subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as energy or matter in quantum physics experiments, depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. People's bodies and their pets have been observed to change when someone they're connected with simply turns attention their way, no matter how far away they are. Individuals and the collective mind can change the readouts from random number generators, as on the network of computers run by the Global Consciousness Project. Now, every field is a unique pattern of vibrations that's different from other fields, and these fields can vibrate along similar patterns, resonating with each other, affecting each other across time and space. As a result, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual mind as part of a larger field. They're equating mind with the quantum or zero-point field out of which all matter and energy arise. And some researchers are using the equations of quantum mechanics, relativity, and the computer learning algorithms to describe the role that consciousness plays in the formation of matter. Together, these understandings help explain things like the law of attraction, how the world around us mirrors what our consciousness is focusing on, accessing information through insight, intuition, and channeling, how dreams can affect the body and the larger consciousness, how music affects the brain and the body and connects us with other minds, how we enhance or slow down healing through our thoughts, emotions, and visualizations, and how the belief in a treatment can help a patient experience healing in the placebo effect, how remote viewing and telekinesis work, and how we can get into a state of flow in which the mind and the brain are in sync, maximizing our effectiveness. You can catch up on our past shows on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, books, and authors that I mention. Today, we're going to explore more of this idea that I talked about a moment ago, the flow state. We've been for a few weeks looking at how this receiver-transmitter we call the brain has been being hacked, to use the current slang, has been being manipulated through electrical stimulation, and how they've been able to identify which parts of the brain are active when different aspects of consciousness are being experienced. We're going to look at a report that looks at specifically what is involved in the flow state. This report was originally published in a journal called Neurologia, and it's a bunch of guys at Drexel University who are looking at how musicians experience the flow state and what's going on in their brain. And what they were exploring specifically was jazz improvisation. And what they found, the findings reveal the creative flow state involves two key factors: extensive experience, which leads to a network of brain areas specialized for generating a particular type of ideas, plus the release of control. This can be called letting go, allowing the network to work with little or no conscious supervision. And they come to this conclusion, these two researchers in particular, came to these conclusions because they realized that the two areas of the brain that would normally be called upon to achieve such a task are actually being disconnected. It's been assumed in the past that flow is a state of highly focused concentration, or what's called hyperfocus, shutting out extraneous thoughts and other distractions. Now, there's a part of the brain that addresses that, where the default network, the particular default network that works together for daydreaming and introspection, which is different from what I've been calling the default network. Okay, so they call it the default mode network, where introspection and daydreams happens, generates ideas under the supervision of another network in the brain, which is called the executive control network up in the frontal lobes. And that determines which parts of the outputs from various parts of the brain will be used. So the assumption was that somehow the executive control network was moderating the behavior of the introspective network. What they're beginning to realize is that through years of intense practice, the brain develops a whole new network, a whole new set of circuits. And this totally agrees with everything we've been saying, that we can rewire the brain. So there's a whole new specialized network or circuit to automatically produce this specific kind of idea. So for jazz improv, this new network is in place and requires neither your introspective focus nor your executive control network to manage it. It actually runs on, quote, autopilot without interference. So there's a new hypothesis that's called expertise plus release. That is, you have the experience, you've built up the network, and the executive control function can let go. To do all of this, they used high-density EEGs, electroencephalograms, from a bunch of guitar players, some of them highly experienced and others less experienced. And they improvised a number of lead sheets based on the presence of drums and piano and bass accompaniment. And the 192 jazz improvs were taken, and they were played for experts to rate the creativity and other qualities. And then the researchers analyzed the EEGs and found that, in fact, wasn't involving that introspective section of the brain, and it wasn't involving the executive control network. It was a whole new network that is associated with that high flow state. So they're saying that it's increased activity in left hemisphere auditory and touch areas, because it's music and they're using a guitar, decreased activity in the superior frontal gyri, the executive control region. So creative flow is associated with reduced conscious control. That is, that front left lobe of the cortex is no longer running our lives when we're in the flow state. So we have some EEG support for what we said a few months ago on the nature of this marvelous state that is the flow state, where the mind, the brain, and the rest of the body are in full alignment, and there is no sense, no need for that network that is the control network to be running the show. So that was a fun new study, and it totally supports our other work around music, how playing music affects the brain and the body and allows for a new level of coherence and consistency across the two. So as we are more experienced with music, whether it's listening it or playing it, it doesn't matter whether you're listening to the music or playing it, you tend to let go with more and more experience of that executive control function, the left frontal lobe of the brain, and become more and more in your mind rather than in your brain. It'll be fun to see what this team continues to do. They're going to look at other creative tasks, such as drawing, maybe even writing, and seeing if they can find similar results. And I have to say, from my own experience, they will. I thought I'd give some other people a chance to talk about flow, some more recent YouTubes that might provide some useful insights.
The phenomenon of becoming one with an activity, known as the flow state, is truly awe-inspiring. It's like merging with the brush that delicately paints a masterpiece, the chisel that skillfully sculpts a timeless statue, or even the pen that passionately writes the story of a lifetime. This profound unity creates a profound sense of harmony and grace, as if engaging in a graceful dance between the self and the task at hand. The result is an extraordinary level of performance that often surpasses our own expectations, leaving us astounded by our own capabilities. Everyone, regardless of background or abilities, possesses the potential to experience this state. It is a universal capability, like breathing or dreaming.
Everyone has this capacity. Anyone can achieve this state. What a delightful realization that we can all do it. And in fact, we all have. We haven't always recognized it. If you're an avid gardener or cook, you don't have to be a musician or an artist. If you love hiking, or if you can get totally lost in a beautiful sunset, or just sitting and petting a cat or a dog, or holding a young baby, watching a young child, watching someone you love, all of those are opportunities to enter this state of consciousness that is called the flow state, in which the front left lobe of the brain, the executive control center, is no longer running things, and there is no other part of the brain trying to make things happen. The mind is in charge when we are in the flow state. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, a radio show exploring what consciousness is, how it works, and how our lives can be greatly enhanced as we understand it more fully. I am Ruth Miller, your host, and that sound tells me it's time to shift gears, maybe look at a book, answer questions you email to me at ruth@noeticmoments.org, or possibly look at what's going on in the news that can help us understand the role our state of consciousness plays in our experience. I'm going to look at a book today. It's called Brain, Mind, and the Narrative Imagination. It's intriguing and totally related to what we're talking about, as it's addressing not only writing, but writing in a way that captures that flow state for others. The book is written by Christopher Comer and Ashley Taggart. It's a Bloomsbury academic book that came out of Great Britain in 2021. The contents include what is our storied mind and what's going on in the neurons. Part 2 is into the neural terrain. Part 3 is the journey from words to narratives. Part 4 is converging paths. And in Part 4, the chapters are affective cognition and sociality. Chapter 8, then, the feeling of what happened, memory, imagination, and self. And then Chapter 10 in this last part is called the Via Dolorosa of the Self. And for those of you who don't know, the Via Dolorosa is the name given to the passageway that people walk along when they are trying to follow the steps of Jesus on his way to the crucifixion. So the introduction says, our interest in science and the narrative imagination began with two deceptively simple questions. How do stories, as told aloud or written, have an impact on us? And what can science, particularly the burgeoning field of neuroscience, bring to our understanding of this process? They go on and they talk about the fact that there's been an iron curtain between those two things and that there's almost no way to address both aspects of those, but they were able to do that. They say, despite recent efforts to introduce ideas of, for example, embodied linguistics, brain lateralization, and affective cognition into the humanistic study of narrative, and despite the best efforts of storytellers to assimilate what is emerging from new brain studies, it is fair to say that the mind-body problem remains a major contributing factor to mistrust and misunderstanding in this field. They go on, the exploration we undertake here is, of course, dictated by our own prejudices, preferences, and competencies. So is, by its very nature, partial. Luckily, we're not traveling blind, but have recourse to the charts of those who have preceded us. They're looking at the role of narrative. They've talked about how during COVID, Netflix had a sudden spike, and they think that that's because there was an urge for immersion in a fictional world, inner voyaging, escapism, and the urge to confront the world at large, engage with the source of threat. And it points out that we encounter those in a variety of opportunities, particularly, they say, narrative answers both of these fundamental drives. And it's perhaps only in, quote, strange times, unquote, that we might start to seriously query the source of this daily preoccupation with the inner narrative. They're going on in the introduction to explain a variety of the techniques that they're using and the fact that the reader needs to be patient, because if the reader is coming from one part of that spectrum, they're not going to understand the other part very well, etc. They go back all the way into the 1920s with I.A. Richards, who was at Cambridge in the 1920s, and he wrote the fundamental texts in literary criticism. The first one in 24, Principles of Literary Criticism, and in 29, Practical Criticism. And really, those have been the basis for almost every literature class you ever took. What was interesting to these writers is that the model shows distinct mental operations occurring at 6 different levels. And it turns out there are 6 structural layers in the cerebral cortex. Well, Richard's model suggests that a line of text is digested for meaning one word at a time. And that proves to be pretty accurate. A large body of work on reading shows that a sentence is not comprehended all at once, but is a series of jumps. There's actually a word that the eyes make a series of jumps called saccades, S-A-C-C-A-D-E-S, or saccades, depending on who you are, across the lines of text. And they alight briefly, acquire the image of a group of letters roughly equal to a word, and immediately jump further along. So Richard's notion of literary criticism is actually pretty well supported by the brain research in the reading process. However, the conversation has gone on through the 50s, the 70s, and they say in 2005, the journal Nature published an issue with a special section on the recent engagement of artists with scientific material and of scientists with the art. 4 articles were devoted to the topic of literature and neuroscience, a strong indicator that the second culture of the humanities is neither uninformed nor uninterested in the neurosciences, which is very cool if you're interested in the history of scientific debate and also if you're interested in how cultures evolve. They're realizing that the term narrative imagination can initially be understood in 2 ways. First, the creative process by which writers explore ideas, emotional states, and their meanings through stories, drama, or verse. And second, the process of assimilating such meanings and constructing inner worlds via reading or listening. So the second, they say, is squarely centered on the reception or reader response, which is what Richards was addressing early on. They suggest that as we move forward, we need to recognize that there is both inspiration and instrument. This distinction between inspirational and instrumental brings a scientific awareness to bear on the narrative reception. They go on into this whole process trying to help us understand how it is that the mind is working here. Most of our attention, they say, will be given to written texts, often literary, always remembering that oral narratives far predate the invention of writing. And then they go on into the ecology of story. Recent observations from anthropology begin to explain what it might mean to say that stories are natural phenomena. Observation of storytelling in pre-literate societies gives us some idea of humankind's deep history. The amount of time we spend in stories. Day conversation is usually about what's going on in the world, and about 1/3 of it is complaining, and about 1/3 of it is the economics. And they point out that typically night conversations are over 3/4 engaged in stories. This was a model put together by an anthropologist named Weisner, W-E-I-S-S-N-E-R, Polly Weisner. She found that when an anecdote was over, others in the group rehashed the details, further embellished and discussed it. The language of stories tended to be rhythmic, complex, and symbolic, with individuals repeating the last words of phrases or adding affirmations. Frequently, listeners were stunned with suspense, nearly in tears, or rolling with laughter. So that's the context for storytelling, and you can hear how that connects with what we're talking about in flow. We're talking about not being controlled by that executive function. And as this book unfolds, they talk more and more about the kinds of cognition, the emotional states, the mental states, and the responses that people have, both in the creation and in the listening. So I thought you'd enjoy knowing about the book, Brain, Mind, and the Narrative Imagination from Bloomsbury Academic by Comer and Taggart. Well, that's it for today's show. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the explanation. You can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there are links to archived past shows along with the titles and other resources we refer to on the shows. And we are getting caught up. If you're used to checking that site out and being disappointed, we got way behind there, but we're getting caught up. And you can send me your comments and questions, which I'll do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.